Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Policy Room at ORFC 2025. It's co-hosted by Sustain and Soil Association. We're delighted to present this session this morning titled Agroecology Across the Four Nations, Unity and Divergence in Approaches. I'd also like to welcome everybody who should be joining us online. This is a hybrid session. We're going to have 90 minutes for today. We're going to start with an opening discussion, which will be led by the chair, followed by a Q&A. So for those of you in the room, just be aware that we'll also be mixing questions from the room with those that come through online. During the Q&A, we would ask that you keep your questions as concise as you can, just to make sure that we allow to hear from as many people as possible and give people the opportunity to ask questions in the room and online. For those of you in the room, we'll have a roving microphone, so do please wait until the microphone comes to you before speaking. Otherwise, those that are listening online won't be able to catch what you're saying. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the chair to start the session. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy it.
Morning, everyone. Good to see you here, especially as I'm sure quite a few of you had some fun last night. You got up, you got out. This is where we are meant to be. So I'm Jenna Hegarty. In my day job, I'm head of policy at the Nature Friendly Farming Network, but today I'm chairing this session. I'm going to introduce my esteemed panelists very shortly. We'll just do a tiny bit of scene setting. I mean, what we're going to do today really is explore just how far farming policy across the UK is or isn't responding to the shared challenges we face. So producing enough food, restoring nature, tackling climate change. They're often portrayed as competing interests, and they certainly can be. But there is a really strong and growing body of evidence that agroecological or nature-friendly approaches to farming offer up multiple win-wins for food, farming, nature and climate. And obviously, following the UK's exit from the European Union, there is significantly more freedom to set domestic farming policy across the UK nations. But the pace and development and clarity of destination does vary considerably. So we all know that how we farm, including how we support farming, has enormous consequences for nature and climate. And of course, the state of nature and the climate has enormous consequences for our ability to farm. So it's no surprise, therefore, that action on farming is routinely highlighted as being absolutely central to tackling the nature and climate crisis, and in turn protecting our long-term ability to farm productively and profitably. So really, this session is going to explore how we're doing. Is it enough? And as David kind of set out, we're going to have a bit of discussion. I'm going to ask the panelists 3 questions, and we'll kind of get through those pretty promptly so that we free up enough time for you lot to ask your questions. Now, the panelists have been sitting very patiently, so I'm going to introduce them so you know who you're targeting your questions to, if you don't already. First up, we have Gianmarco Currado, who is the Director responsible for Rural Affairs at the Welsh Government. Like George, sitting next to him, who I'll introduce next, Gianmarco has sometimes an enviable role of managing multiple competing stakeholder demands on what farming policy should look like in Wales, including those of his political masters. And with a background in EU policy and negotiations, Gianmarco will probably understand better than most the risks and opportunities that sitting outside the EU brings to domestic farming policy development and delivery. George Burgess is Gianmarco's counterpart in the Scottish Government and has had a very varied career there over the last almost 25 years, including Head of Sustainable Development and Head of Criminal Law and Licensing. But his current role, which is Director of Agriculture and Rural Economy, is obviously the best yet and is why he's on the panel today. Next, we have Jill Montgomery, Agri-Environment Project Manager at Northern Ireland Environment Link, so NEIL for short. NEIL is a membership body for organisations interested in and working on the natural and built environment in Northern Ireland. And Jill coordinates the Sustainable Agriculture Policy Working Group, and that channels coordinated input into stormwater policy development and delivery on farming and land use. And last but no means least, we have Alex Mackaness, who is the Nature and Land Use Programme Manager at the Labour Climate and Environment Forum, LSEF for short. LSEF is a relatively new kid on the block, launching in late 2022, and works to strengthen climate and environmental ambition across the Labour movement. Alex himself comes from a farming background and has worked on farming and environmental policy as a consultant for charities and for DEFRA prior to joining LSEF. So there are our experts. And as you'll have noticed, we've got a bit of a mix of those who sit within government and are policymakers, and those who sit outside government and essentially shape from the outside. So I think that kind of diversity will bring some really interesting kind of aspects to the discussion today. So there are our experts. I am your chair. We will crack on. So my first question, I'm going to work from left to right, and you've got kind of max of 5 minutes to kind of set the scene. Can you all just set out the vision for food and farming policy in your part of the UK and the pathway for getting there? Go for it, Gianmarco. And I'm going to...
Are you going to hand over? Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Bodada. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come here today. So our vision in Wales is for a thriving agriculture sector that produces food sustainably, that meets our climate and nature ambitions, and very importantly supports our rural communities, our culture and our language. I'll start very briefly just by a brief legal context. I think it's important, and this hits at the heart of devolution. We've got a specific legal context in Wales. The two acts that I will mention this morning that are the most relevant for me are the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the Agricultural Wales Act of 2023. So the Wellbeing of Future Generation Act, very simply put, puts a legal obligation on ministers not just to consider the here and now, but to consider what is best for future generations. The Agricultural Wales Act is the first time that agriculture has, or that Wales has its own agriculture legislation bespoke. And the key bit of that act are the 4 sustainable land management objectives. So in effect, ministers are legally obliged in providing support to agriculture and ancillary activities to meet these 4 SLM objectives. And they are sustainable food production, mitigating and tackling climate change, mitigating and adapting to climate change, protecting nature, in effect, and supporting our rural communities, our culture and our language. So ministers are legally obliged to demonstrate that that's what they're doing, and that is the framework in which we're developing our future farming policy. The cornerstone of it will be the Sustainable Farming Scheme, which we are in the final stages of development. The plan is for it to be introduced in 2026. Unlike what's happening in England, it'll be a whole farm scheme, so it'll aim to provide a payment based on a whole farm approach. It will have a universal layer The universal layer will be basically a set of actions that farmers will have to do in order to receive that universal payment, and I'll talk a bit about it later. And then there'll be an optional and collaborative layer to the scheme, which will be where we want farmers, hopefully, to increasingly move into to provide a lot of those additional benefits for climate and environment. That process of development has been a long one. And I think that it is and it was a topic of conversation at the other conference yesterday, it isn't easy to design a post-Brexit agriculture support scheme that tries to meet all those challenges that we are trying to deal with. So it has been a long process. With length comes uncertainty, but I think from our perspective in Wales, that time has been used incredibly wisely to try and engage and work in partnership with all interests, not just the farming sector, but with all interests, including the NGOs, the wider supply chain, the forestry sector, etc. And my Deputy First Minister, who's in charge of this area, if you ever hear him speak, will often talk about two things: listening and working in collaboration, and that is very much what we're trying to do. We're trying to develop a scheme that meets those 4 sustainable land management objectives, that encourages as many farmers to be part of it, and therefore to be on that journey towards sustainable food production. I'll just finish very briefly on what's happening now. So we're now in 2025. We're in what we've called the preparatory phase for SFS. So we're trying to move the sector on in readiness for the scheme. We've done broadly two things. We've tried to provide some stability by maintaining the basic payment scheme at the level that it has been for the last few years, to try and give a bit of a handhold for farmers, to something to hang on to during this transition. But we've then put out a lot of schemes that are designed to prepare farmers for the world that is coming. So things like our Habitat Wales scheme, that is building on what was Glasstir, which was an EU rural development programme scheme to try and bring as much habitat land that's on farm under active management ahead of that being almost certainly a requirement of the sustainable farming scheme. So that's very broadly where we are. I'll just finish by saying it is, for us, it is absolutely key, given the importance of farming to Wales, to our rural communities, but not just to our urban communities as well. It is absolutely key that we design something that gives that vibrant future for farming, that encourages young people into it, that builds on and uses all that exciting innovation that is happening out there, so that there is a viable and sustainable future for our sector. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or Madam Ma, as they might say in some parts of Scotland, not necessarily the part of Scotland that I'm from. I think what you'll probably hear this morning is quite a bit of commonality about what's happening in different parts of the UK. The same challenges of climate and nature and food security. Differences in the approach, both in the details of schemes and how we're going about it, but a lot that is actually still common across the parts of the UK. So in Scotland, we have our Vision for Agriculture published in early 2022. And that sets out that we want to be a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture. So we don't do our ambition by half. We want to be a sort of global leader and out there. How we get there, a little bit more challenging. Gianmarco talked about 2 acts of Parliament in Wales. I could raise them 3 in Scotland, but I'll talk mainly about 2 of them. Critical one, and just passed by the Scottish Parliament earlier this summer, is the Agriculture and Rural Communities Scotland Act. Now that is the act that tries to embody the vision that we've set out, and to give us the powers to create the new schemes that we need in Scotland. We have an act from 2020 that allowed us to make some tweaks, some simplifications, some improvements to the existing European schemes that we're still running on. So we have used that. We are using that to make some of the changes right now before we really start using the new act in earnest. Now, I will have to refer to my notes just as to make sure that I get it quite right at what the objectives we've set out in the new Act. So what it is aiming to do is to facilitate the adoption and use of sustainable and regenerative agricultural practices, production of high quality food, promotion and support of agricultural practices that protect and improve animal health and welfare, facilitation of on-farm nature restoration, climate mitigation and adaptation, and crucially for us, enabling rural communities to thrive. So I think our ministers would say that the rural communities aspect of the Act is really quite a critical one. The approach that we've set out, our plans for the future, are based on a tiered structure, 4 tiers of support. The first 2 are the base and enhanced. Now those will both be forms of direct payments that will be familiar to many farmers. So we're not taking the approach as in England of phasing out direct payments. We still see them as being an important part of the underpinning support, but they will be increasingly conditional. So it's not just you've got the acreage, you get your payment. There will be more conditions attached to that. The elective tier that is above that is going to be more the sort of areas where you can apply and it will be competitive to get funding for that. The complementary tier at the top, well, at the top, it's maybe really at the bottom. It's the underpinning support, the farm advice that will enable everyone to make changes. Right now, what we're doing, we are introducing what we call the whole farm plan. This is part of the conditionality that we're attaching to the basic payments. And that, from this year, will require farmers to pick 2 from 5 measures. So carbon auditing, soil testing, animal health and welfare plans, integrated pest management, and biodiversity. So baby steps still, they can choose what to do, but over time that will become more demanding. How we're doing this, some would say slowly. We would say that's because we're trying to do it in a sort of collaborative approach, co-production with the sector, with academia. And it's a pleasure to see Pete Ritchie, one of the fellow members of the wonderfully named Agriculture Reform Implementation Oversight Board, in the audience. He's promised that he's not going to shout rubbish too many times during this presentation, but really trying to make sure that we work collaboratively with the sector rather than risk, as we might see in other areas, changes being made and then regretted later. So that's what we're trying to do, but it is quite a challenge.
Good morning, and it's great to be here from Northern Ireland Environment Link, which Jenna mentioned is a membership body in Northern Ireland which lobbies government on environmental policy. If I'd known it was going to be a language competition this morning, I would have practiced both my Irish and my Ulster Scots just to keep things balanced. Just want to start with, on the 29th of December just past, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Hilary Benn, said on local BBC radio that Northern Ireland is just like the rest of the UK, except that it's completely different. So in this session, I will try and unpick that in the context of agri-environment policy. I have 2 slides. I'm not going to kill you with PowerPoint, but I just felt that was important just to set the scene. So if Emmett at the back could just pull up this first slide for me, please. The one after that. Thank you. So teaching Granny to suck eggs here, but I feel it's important to say we are still here, okay? We are still part of the United Kingdom. We use sterling, pound sterling. So might come from the Ulster Bank, but still sterling. And we are part of the wider island of Ireland. Nature knows no borders, thankfully. We have a population of about 1.9 million, a third of which live in rural areas, which is quite significant for this discussion today. About 5,500 square miles, so about 75% the size of Wales. About 3/4 of our land is used for farming. And this is also important for today's discussion. The agri-food industry in Northern Ireland is really significant for both the rural and the regional economy, and 3 times more important in employment terms as to the UK as a whole. So this really does impact our discussions. There is a real or perceived pressure to maintain that agri-production output. And that causes a drive towards intensification for profits. So all these are very important considerations. Most of our farms are classified as very small, so about 40 hectares, again about half the size of the average farm size in the UK, and heavily dependent on the basic payment schemes. We've had massive changes in the agricultural landscape over the last 40 years, from a sort of mixed arable and livestock to now much more improved and managed grassland for our dairy, sheep and beef production. So Northern Ireland, as you may know, looking from an environmental point of view, have many, many beautiful landscapes, including UK's biggest inland lake, Lough Neagh, which unfortunately you've seen on the news recently for the wrong reasons. Northern Ireland's environmental health and biodiversity is not in a good place and in decline. We have experienced significant biodiversity loss. In 2020, research by the Natural History Museum, Northern Ireland ranked, was it 12th worst in the world for biodiversity loss out of 240 countries surveyed. And we have a particular challenge around emissions. Ammonia emissions is a really toxic, volatile subject at the moment. And agriculture is reported to contribute to 12% of the total UK emissions for 3% of the population. And unlike the other jurisdictions here today, it's my understanding that our emissions are still rising. Again, agricultural intensification is driving pressure. So the next slide, you could be forgiven for thinking that this looks like the security barrier to Stormont Parliament buildings. There should be Stormont Parliament buildings in the background there, but this is just a really crude timeline to show you what we have all come through and what is specific to Northern Ireland. So we've all come through post-war agricultural boom in production, which was much needed at the time. We've all come through, all the jurisdictions here today, joining the European Economic Community in 1973, along with CAP and the Common Agricultural Policy reforms. We've all come through UK devolution, and if we're absolutely honest, we're all working in the context of a very broken and fragmented and unjust food system. However, specific to Northern Ireland, we have had a really, really challenging stop-start nature of government leadership. The red bars marked up there show the 40% of time since the Good Friday Agreement that our government has been in a state of collapse. And this undoubtedly has had a massive impact on our policy developments, where we are very much behind the curve, and we'll get a bit more time to talk about that later. However, I want to end on a positive note. Our Assembly resumed in February, and we are awash with agri policies and consultations. Our Environment Act, our first new food strategy, a new environment improvement plan. We're rolling out the commitments of the Climate Act. We are the only devolved nation so far to have secured a ring-fenced budget for agriculture, so thanks to our Minister Muir and his team for that. And we have a number of cutting-edge initiatives like our Regional Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, which is probably the first of its kind in the world. So while the government pathway for food and farming is definitely still not clear, we do have reasons to be more hopeful for the next 5 years than the last. Thank you.
Hi everyone, great to be here. So, as Jenna set out, LSEF, we are independent from the Labour Party. We work across the Labour movement, but I repeat, we are an independent organisation and not part of the party, nor of government. And I think this setup is quite interesting, and it will get an array of different answers here. We focus on the high-level politics, actually, and think about the framing of a lot of these issues. So I think for this answer, I think you will all know this, but just in terms of the context, we have a new government. Brexit happened in 2016, and at the time, the vision of the UK government was really one of moving away from area-based payments, stemming from the CAP that was just mentioned, the EU policy, towards public money for public goods. And that was the cornerstone of the vision, I guess. But it wasn't the full picture, and the Agriculture Act had other elements to it. And the reason I mention this is because the context for that is that actually at the time, the new land management scheme, the new payment scheme, was never intended to fully replace the basic payment scheme. And instead, there was supposed to be a whole suite of other changes across the supply chain that would, for example, improve incomes for farmers and the like. Now, where we are now is that second suite of things has not really happened. And there is a very challenging environment for farmers right now. And yeah, that supply chain reform has not happened, but there's a lot of stock being placed on the new environmental land management schemes. So Labour, a new government, their manifesto vision was very light on detail. That was political. Let's not muddy the water ahead of an election. Since then, we've seen 5 priorities from Steve Reed. 2 of them include food security and nature restoration. We've also heard Steve Reed talk about growth quite a lot, and there's a reason for that. It's because by 2029, the Labour government want to have improved the lives of ordinary people. That means improving public services. That means, in their theory of change, growing the economy. So a lot of what DEFRA and Steve Reed are thinking about is how can DEFRA become a growth department, whether we like that or not. And actually, that's why he's talked about the circular economy quite a lot. We heard from Steve Reed yesterday at Oxford Farming Conference, and I think it's fair to say the vision for agriculture isn't there yet. Things are coming together, though. And we heard him outline the plans for a roadmap, 25-year roadmap for agriculture. And he set out sort of 3 strands to that. The first was backing farmers within supply chains, in trade deals, and in public procurement. The second one was diversifying incomes for farmers beyond just food production. And the third, which I thought was good, that he explicitly talked about, was nature underpinning farm businesses. And I think that's a good positive step. And by that, really, he means getting the environmental land management scheme, as it is named in England context, working. So there is a plan coming together. I don't think the vision exists just yet. The other context is that there are plenty of strategies, stock takes, consultations coming up. We've got a food strategy, a land use framework consultation, an environmental improvement plan review, a review of regulation within the department as well. And that all has to somehow come together into a coherent vision for the sector. So there's lots to do, but I think it's fair to say at the moment the approach has been, let's take a step back and define our vision. So more to come.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. Great. Thank you, folks. So I think that scene setting across the four speakers there was really useful in terms of just, not that we need reminding how important agriculture as a land use is, but just how important it is across each of the 4 UK countries, how important it is socially, economically, and environmentally, and also the kind of the stark reality that wherever we are in the UK, the environmental picture is currently very, very challenging, with agriculture very much at the heart of that, but also at the heart of recovery and solutions. I will move us on to the next question, keep things going. We've had, obviously, a kind of overview of kind of the key elements of the policy structure in place in each of the UK countries, focusing on particularly on direct farm support. Again, working from left to right, could you kind of briefly set out how that kind of policy package, or at least what we understand of it thus far, will or won't kind of tackle the nature and climate crisis, which if anyone needs a reminder, has been identified very, very clearly as the biggest mid to long-term threat to food security. So it is pretty darn important. And feel free to refer to the kind of underpinning workings, I suppose, the kind of rationale, the evidence base, because we can all say really nice words about this is going to do this. It's like, but where's the proof as far as you can?
Okay, thank you very much. So, as I said in my introduction, 2 of the sustainable land management objectives of the Agricultural Wales Act are about climate change and about nature. So our ministers, my ministers, are legally obliged to demonstrate that when they use the powers of support, they are tackling those 2 challenges. You know, we were one of the first to declare a climate and nature emergency. We've got, obviously, like the other jurisdictions, climate change targets in law that we have to meet, and we're about to legislate for some nature targets as well, some biodiversity targets. So that is the framing. A bit like the others. I mean, Jill mentioned Northern Ireland. I think it's over 80% of the land mass of Wales is farmed in one way or another. So there is no doubt that the sector has to make a significant contribution to helping the country as a whole meet these targets. So in November we published the revised outline scheme for the SFS. So this is the next stage in the evolution of that co-design. And there's a few things in there that address these 2 topics specifically. So the first thing is the 10% habitat requirement. So we've proposed that under the universal layer of the scheme, 10% of each farm will have to be managed as habitat. So in order for a farmer to come into the sustainable farming scheme in 2026, one of the universal actions, so one of the actions that they will receive payment for will be to manage 10% of the farmer's habitat. What we've set out in the scheme outline and what we've set out in previous publications are options for creating temporary habitat where farmers aren't at that level yet, and we're working through at the moment as part of the next stage of development what other options there may be for temporary habitat creation. So that is, for us, that is an incredibly important part of the scheme. It will be a universal, or we propose at the moment that it will be a universal requirement. And for us, that is a big part of addressing or moving towards addressing some of our nature objectives. As I said, in the interim, we've had Habitat Wales in 2024, which was basically paying those farmers who wanted to apply a payment for managing their current habitat. And we were very pleased that in 2024 we actually brought in more habitat under management than we had under Glasteer in 2023, so under our Rural Development Programme scheme. We've renewed that commitment for 2025. So we have Habitat Wales 2025 that will be applied for by farmers through the single application form. And again, for us, that is a step towards getting farmers ready for what we are now proposing will be the requirement for 2026, that all habitat land on farm will be managed and paid for, and where it's not up to 10%, temporary habitat will have to be created to meet that, to move to that level. So that's one thing. The other thing that which there's been a huge amount of debate about in Wales is about tree planting. The proposal that we consulted on this time last year was that a minimum of 10% of each farm to enter the scheme would have to be woodland, and that where that level wasn't met, farmers would have 5 years to plant up to that level. That created a huge amount of angst, I think it's fair to say, in the farming community in Wales, which led to a number of protests. And we have been working really hard over the last 6 months, to not just with the farming sector, but with this wider group that the minister has brought together on his ministerial roundtable, to try and find a way, basically, of getting as many trees planted on farms in a way that works together with sustainable food production. What we've proposed, and as part of that we did a carbon sequestration evidence review. So a subgroup of the ministerial roundtable went off and interviewed a huge number of academics and experts in the field, and we published alongside the scheme outline in November this evidence review on carbon sequestration. What we've proposed now in November is that there will be a universal requirement for each farm under the scheme to produce a woodland and hedgerow opportunity plan, which will basically show them where they have an opportunity to increase their woodland cover and to increase their hedgerow cover in the scheme. There will then be money available through the optional layer for farmers to then plant trees and hedgerows in line with that opportunity plan. And what we've said we will do in order to make sure we don't lose the momentum on increasing woodland cover, which is what we need to do to meet our net zero ambitions, we're going to set a scheme-wide target for woodland cover and probably for hedgerow creation, and we will then create a governance mechanism with farming unions and others to help make sure we implement those targets. So those are the proposals at the moment. Just to be clear, they are proposals, because what we're doing now is we've put all of this into our environmental land use modelling that we have in Wales to see what the impact will be of these proposals on potential land use change based on that modelling. From that, we will derive an economic analysis, and all of that will come back to ministers at some point in the next 6 months for them to take some final decisions. So that's where we are at the moment in terms of the scheme. There's a load of other activity along the side. So we have things like the peatland restoration programme, where we're funding. We've put significant amounts of money towards peatland restoration, all part of our net zero target. So there is an absolute desire, not just a desire, but there's a legal need for ministers to demonstrate that they are meeting these challenges. We will see what the revised modelling tells us about how far that will get us. Farming is absolutely important, and agriculture is absolutely important in meeting those targets. But it has to be an economy-wide effort as well. So it's about how all this fits in with other activities that can be delivered by the public and private sector to plant trees and to look after our biodiversity and nature.
So a lot of the framing in Scotland is very similar in terms of statutory targets on climate change and increasingly around biodiversity. One of the extra bits that we've got, and maybe relevant just given the mention of Steve Reid's plan for a food strategy of some sort for England, we have in Scotland the Good Food Nation Act from 2022, and that is aiming to create a holistic approach to food, from farm to fork and beyond. We, as national government, have to produce a Good Food Nation plan. We will also be looking to local authorities, health boards and others to produce their own plans. Great, you've got a plan, what do you do about it? No, we can't just leave it on the shelf. We will actually be required by that act to have regard to that plan when exercising particular functions, including those in agriculture. We will also be required under our Agriculture and Rural Communities Act to produce a rural support plan, and that is a longer term plan, and again it needs to set out how what we're doing is going to hit the mark on climate change, on biodiversity. I just wanted to pick up on some of the challenges that we've got here, and particularly money. Because one of the challenges we've had in Scotland for the last couple of years has been a shortage of money generally, but in particular in capital. So we've known the sort of things that we've wanted to do, but we haven't necessarily been able to support the industry as much as we would like to achieve it. One of the successes we had in the recent budget was to secure 46 million. Now, admittedly, that was money that had previously been in our budgets, had been surrendered in previous years to help the wider government budget in Scotland. But we've got it coming back into our budget for the next 2 years, and importantly, coming back as capital, so that we will be able to provide capital support to farms, to landowners, to help them make progress on the sorts of measures that we're looking for. One of the other challenges, just to be very frank, is around IT. We've published the list of the sort of measures that we want to see implemented. But when it then comes to actually trying to get our government computer systems to play ball with us, that's quite a challenge. So at the moment, some of the ambition, what we're trying to achieve, is being tempered by what we can actually get the computer to say, and we're trying to get it not to say no all the time. But we keep working on that.
So just to recap on the question, it was about the limitations of those policy packages and how we can tackle them. So when I put this question to Neil's members, Northern Ireland Environment Link's members of the Sustainable Agri Policy Group, they agreed 3 things. The first was, for the limitations, that is, lack of investment in agri-environment schemes, I should say meaningful agri-environment schemes, lack of clear and consistent policy direction, and lack of ambition around agri-environment and a sense of it being undervalued in Northern Ireland. So I just want to look at each of those very briefly, and we might get into more detail on them at the question and answer session. So budgets is a very predictable thing to talk about. We can't grow more money on trees, but we can look at using more effectively what we have. Agri-environment schemes in Northern Ireland are vastly underfunded. It's about less than 3% of the agri-budget versus 20 to 25% in other jurisdictions. So we're really falling behind the curve there, and hopeful in the ring-fenced agri-budget that our Minister has now secured, that he will have some decision-making capacity to invest more in meaningful agri-environment schemes. You will all be familiar, I imagine, with the scale of need economic report. So I think all of our jurisdictions need more money than we will be allocated, but hopefully in repurposing we can really focus on sustainable initiatives and longer cycles of funding for farmers. I come from a farming background. I've managed our farm for a number of years in the past, and the funding cycles really are very difficult for long-term planning. The second point was policy direction. In Northern Ireland, we are hopefully in a new wave of policy direction, but we need to make sure that all these new policies are aligned. Do the outputs and outcomes of our food strategy framework match those of some of the other policies? We have a new programme for government. We have now got our Climate Change Act, albeit late in 2022. There's a number of requirements out of that. And we need national alignment of policies too. So procurement, for example, in Northern Ireland, although we export 70% of our agri-food production, there's not a single school, care home or hospital in Northern Ireland that actually uses our local food. There's something around central procurement there that just doesn't make sense. The third thing, and I feel really passionate about this actually, is the ambition. We need to provide farmers with a more compelling vision of the future and have support structures to get them there, not just the finances, but also knowledge and skills and investing in peer-to-peer learning. I mean, I don't know about you lot or if there's farmers out there, but I'd never go to a policy person for advice on farming. I want to learn from my farmer mates, okay? So we need to invest in that properly. A word for any media out there, can we please stop farmer bashing and spreading divisive narratives and start giving progressive farmers a voice? They have so much to say. There's so much going on in each of our countries, in Northern Ireland too. We have wonderful cluster groups emerging and some really good experimental projects. And also relationships. Northern Ireland Environment Link is investing very much in relationships with the agri-sector, and that is really important. Just want to finish on, it's not another point, but it's something we do need to discuss a little bit more, is the definition of food security at domestic level is unclear. So, for example, Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. We are producing enough edible protein in our agri-food industry to feed 10 million people. However, we are left with the pollution, the loss of biodiversity and monoculture farming. We need to be thinking about UK as a whole in how we actually define domestic food security and food production. There seems to be a mismatch between the economic commodity and the environmental solutions. So there is a very real pressure in Northern Ireland to increase production, and that needs to be dealt with at a national level too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. So I'll break this down into two parts. I think the first is where we're at with the farming schemes. Our nature targets are extremely dependent on these schemes working. There's been some progress. The lower tiers of the schemes, the SFI, we've seen an uptick in applications. And actually, I heard yesterday at Oxford Farming Conference a really passionate defence from a farmer of the SFI scheme because of the choice that it gave him as an individual farmer to sort of prioritise food production versus other things. Obviously, those nature and food production need to come together. But I think what we're lacking still, and what the government has inherited in England is the higher tiers of the schemes are not functioning as we need them to be. And perhaps we can go into more detail on that in a bit. But that is a real problem. Money is a huge issue. But with budgetary constraints, we need to be doing more with what we have at the moment. So that's the kind of, that's a very high level answer to where the schemes are. My lofty answer is really around where I think we need the conversation to be now. And I'm hearing more and more, it's been good at these two conferences to hear more and more about resilience. And I think there's been a reason for that. We've had about the wettest 24 months on record. That's been really difficult for many farmers, and incomes have been impacted because of that, and our production domestically has been severely impacted. But it's not just here that we're seeing challenges to the global food system, it's overseas as well. And there was an interesting talk, again, at OFC yesterday, where someone presented some modelling of, if it was a scenario in which there were 3 or 4 big major shocks to the global food system, all happening at once in 1 year. They've all happened already, but they haven't all happened in 1 year. And they modelled what would happen if that did come together, that sort of perfect storm. And the impact on food prices, lack of production, and civil unrest from it was absolutely serious. So the political challenge is very much there, and it is so crucial that our domestic production and domestic food system is as resilient as it can be. And for me, I think one of the key parts of that is, one, it needs to be underpinned by biodiversity, nature. But I think we can extend that to diversity more widely. And I think it was good to hear Steve Reed talking about the need for diverse income streams, the need for nature to underpin farming. But I would like to see more talk of diversifying what we grow in this country, more horticulture, more pulses, more legumes, for example. I think we need to move the conversation to resilience. I think that's where we need to be heading, because without that, we haven't got very much. And I think it's still TBC as to whether the current policy framework gives us that resilience. I would argue right now it probably doesn't. The other thing I think we must have more of is leadership on farming. We've seen some interesting political decisions recently in the sector. And to win back the farming community, we need to see leadership. And that's not just from Steve Reed, that's from the rest of government. So we need to see Wes Streeting talking about a food strategy. We need to see Angela Rayner talking about biodiversity net game. We need to see other departments, Johnny Reynolds talking about the groceries code adjudicator and supply chains, for example. That is how we demonstrate real leadership for farming and move the conversation on. I think the other thing we need to talk more about is the role of business in farming, the role business in supply chains, and the role that big companies have in shifting us towards more sustainable practices and creating more resilient supply chains in doing so.
Brilliant, thanks. So, kind of, I suppose, a range of perspectives there in terms of how fit for purpose our policy frameworks, particularly for direct farm support, are to tackle the variety of challenges that we face. but also some very, very useful kind of placing of that support in a much broader context of other levers and tools that need to be deployed, so that we are kind of fit for not just the future, but, you know, because the future is here in terms of the challenges that we are facing. And I suppose just a couple of very small observations from me, which I think that the talks here have just kind of underpinned. I think the level of kind of political and policy urgency across the board, not just within kind of agricultural ministries, just doesn't match the level of urgency in terms of the challenges that we're facing and are here now. Alex mentioned the very, very, very wet winters that we've been facing. We haven't got all the time in the world. And also, I suppose the second point is around that kind of, you know, the analysis and evidence base, which does feel pretty dry at times, but it's just really bloody important. You know, what is the evidence base for what is being put on the table in each of the 4 UK countries, including how they kind of work together? There's not a lot of that, or if there is, it's not often publicly available so that, you know, stakeholders can scrutinise. So actually, what's the confidence level in terms of, you know, a measure here, a package there, and a bunch of outputs? So that's, I suppose, slightly with lifting my chair hat off. That's my slight challenge. But I'm going to move very quickly to my final question before we open the room up. And this has been mentioned. We know nature knows no borders. Climate change does not care about UK devolution either. And the UK is, as a whole, a signatory to the Paris Agreement. It is a signatory to the Global Biodiversity Framework. So thinking kind of, you know, like beyond, you know, the kind of the borders that we've been talking about so far within the UK, how well are the 4 UK nations collaborating on policy development and delivery? And this time, let's go from Alex this way.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. So I'm probably the least qualified to talk about this answer, but there was an interesting session at OFC yesterday, which was a sort of discussion between the devolved nations and sort of plans for agriculture. One of the questions was should there sort of be a UK-wide framework for agriculture? And as was expected, the pushback was severe and no way. And that's for good reason, of course. Each country is very different. It was encouraging to hear that there has been a step change in collaboration since the new UK Labour government has come in. That is positive, and there's been specific collaboration on the need to improve food security. And actually, as part of that, you know, there should be lessons learned between nations. I don't think UK Labour have necessarily learned the lessons they perhaps needed to politically from perhaps the Welsh example on the SFS, with recent inheritance tax policy introductions. Whatever you think of the policy, the politics around that wasn't handled in a way that was probably optimal, and there's certainly lessons that can come from that policy aside. I would just say there are some challenges though, and there needs to be this collaboration. In particular for me, something close to my heart is land use. There's an English land use strategy to be consulted on very shortly. That's really good. There will have to be some interplay between how land is being used across the UK. We have, you know, UK-wide climate targets, for example, and we need to be thinking about how we can complement one another. But politically, it would be very, very challenging to have a kind of UK-wide land use framework. So, and some of the other things that were talked about yesterday were you know, divergences in approaches to regulation. Gene editing, precision breeding is something that's increasingly talked about in OFC. Across the road, it was, you know, really championed yesterday. Not everyone agrees that that is the right route, but that is a problem in terms of our relationship with the EU versus internal markets. So that collaboration is certainly important, but there's some challenges coming down the road.
So for this question, we were asked to think about what's working well and on a national collaboration front and where there's room for improvement. So I'll look at what's working well first because that's quicker. So from a food and farming perspective, it's definitely risen up the political and public agenda from a disconnect of many decades, and that's a good thing. As Alex said, we are making progress in the multifunctional land use framework. We are talking about it. It has been a toxic subject for a long time, and we are making inroads. In Northern Ireland, we're about to start some of those workshops. And we have a growing number, maybe disparate at times, but a growing number of fantastically innovative farmers cracking on with holistic farm planning, which has got to be the way forward. In Northern Ireland, we've more than 3,000 farmers working with some of our environmental organisations on sustainable farming plans. So that's all good, and we're getting some links with the health sector now. I know they're very distracted at the moment, but in terms of long-term links with food and investing in health rather than health always being a cost, I think we're starting to have some discussions right now. So room for improvement. So it's a bit predictable, but making a bigger impact through improved collaboration across the UK, devolved nations, I think, is something that we want to talk about. Labour's promising to power up Britain, and we have some examples of national projects, but I think making a bigger impact with collaboration at national level. You have the Agri Bill, and we're not going to have time to talk about this in this question, but trade has to be discussed, and how loyalty to farmers is manifested in our trade negotiations. The second point really is about telling the truth, and I'm a big one for believing in telling the truth. Firstly, the world is not producing what the world needs to be eating. We have a completely broken and unjust food system where farmers are taking all the risk and getting very little money. We're controlled by global brands. We have a market that drives consumption through obesogenic diets. So can we can't fully address the farming transformation without addressing the food system. So we need to be truthful about that. Something Alex has mentioned already is, have we really got a clear and consistent plan for 2030 and 2050 for our net zero pathway, for our sustainable agri plans? I'm going to let you maybe ask questions about that later, but perhaps at that point Emmett could just put up the last slide that I had. So yeah, we need to be thinking about where we're at with our vision and clarity. It's the slide after that, Emmett, please. So I really like this little systems change model. And if we look at it and think about our plans, we can kind of see why we're getting some confusion, anxiety, resistance, frustration, and false starts. So I just, if you don't mind, we'll leave that model up for some of the other questions. So the last point in this, the last big point really was about how we mobilise the public's fresh engagement around food and farming. As I've said, we've had decades of a disconnect, thanks to convenience foods, supermarkets, just a disconnect from the land generally. But, Ukraine, COVID crisis, everything started to connect people again. But we don't seem to know how to use that energy and mobilise it for change. So the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission have done a really good conversation series, and people are talking about not just the type of food they want, but also the type of society they want. It's interlinked. And they also want government and retailers to take more responsibility on the type of food that they are offered. So there's a lot of nanny state excuses used a lot of the time, but actually what the citizens are saying is that they want better leadership and better choices on this. So we can't just leave things to the market like some of the market fundamentalists think. And then a few smaller points, and then I'll pass on. But knowledge and skills, getting a better range of perspectives around the decision-making table, including from across the globe. Our research tends to have a Western bias. So what are we learning from our international neighbours? We need to keep global goals in mind and not just local ones. There's no point in getting it right here and exporting all our environmental challenges and emissions halfway across the world. And also, something we've noticed in Northern Ireland is you have to come to the table being aware of not just what you want, but also your trade-offs. And if we all come just immovable on what we want, it's going to be stagnant. But obviously, we need clarity in the vision before we can decide what our trade-offs are. So, thank you.
Should there be more collaboration? I think the obvious answer to that is yes. I doubt you get anyone that's going to argue, no, we definitely shouldn't be collaborating. I'll maybe focus more on the intergovernmental collaboration, because that's the world that Gianmarco and I inhabit. First, the point about a UK framework. Agriculture in the UK is not homogeneous, and differences, you might call them divergences of policy, didn't begin with Brexit. They didn't even begin with devolution. I mean, we had a separate board of agriculture in Scotland going back to the early years of the previous century. We have had different schemes in Scotland, particularly we still have voluntary coupled support schemes for sheep and beef that don't exist, perhaps have never existed in some of the other parts of the UK. So difference is not new, it's been with us for a long time. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't collaborate, engage with the other administrations. As we said earlier, the challenges we're facing on climate change and biodiversity are common challenges. So we do need to engage with the other administrations. We also need to get over, and this is as much for us as it is for UK government, the not made here syndrome. There will be good parts of sustainable farming incentive that we can learn from. There may be things that we're doing that other administrations can learn from. As part of the post-Brexit situation, systems of intergovernmental relations were established, and for quite a long time they worked well. When Michael Gove, George Eustace were in the Secretary of State seat in Whitehall, we had regular interministerial meetings with all four administrations, or three sometimes when the red bar was in place in Northern Ireland. So we had good interaction at that senior ministerial level. Not always agreement, but good interaction. And below that, a whole support structure within the civil service. So policy coordination groups where we're sharing information, learning from each other, ensuring that there were no surprises. Those, unfortunately, fell away under some of the more recent Secretaries of State, and it is really good that that has been reset, so that we now have, with Steve Reid and his ministerial team in DEFRA, much better, more collaborative arrangements between ministers, and really long may that continue. The interministerial group is an institution, a bit like marriage. It all depends on the individuals. You can have all the greatest structures on paper, but it does come down to the individuals and the individuals wanting to make it work. So I think we are currently in a position where we do have individuals in those seats that are wanting to make it work, so that we can work effectively together.
Thanks, George. Just a few quick thoughts, because a lot has been said already, but it is absolutely true that we're all facing the same challenges, whether it's within the four nations of the UK, or within the different interests that are represented. In the end, we're all facing the same challenges. If I observe our experience on collaboration within Wales, there is no doubt that the the conversation has been a lot healthier and a lot more productive over the last 6 to 9 months, partly because I think I do think the different interest groups, as Jill mentioned, have come to the table with perhaps a more honest understanding that we're all facing similar challenges, and perhaps a more honest recognition that we've got to find a sensible way through that that delivers all of these different objectives. Because there are absolutely examples out there, including from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, of where you can do all these things on farm. You can be economically viable, you can protect your environment, you can reduce your inputs, your costs and your emissions. You can do all of those things. So the knowledge, the innovation, the enthusiasm, the experience is out there. It isn't not out there. It's about how do you grow that? How do you mainstream that more? How do you tackle some of what my Deputy First Minister would call the more knotty issues, some of the more difficult ones? But I think coming to that table and having those honest conversations, recognizing that in the end, and I totally agree with Alex, in the end, resilience in all its different forms is what this is about. This is how do we make farming more resilient to those changes in climate that are inevitable regardless of what we do. How do you make farming more resilient to those geopolitical changes? And in doing so, how do you help society tackle those big challenges of climate and nature? So I think collaboration in that sense is really important. And I agree with George. I mean, in the end, we have got different makeups within the 4 nations of the UK. And I think, if you look at Wales, the ability to design a whole farm system as opposed to design a suite of schemes like they are in England, for me, is absolutely right. Our farming makeup, the fact that we've got an awful lot of small family farms, they would not do well in an English-style system. It's as simple as that. So the ability to be able to tailor our approach to what we have is hugely important. But I think it's also important that we collaborate, we look at each other's knowledge, we share information, data, evidence, because in the end we are all trying to tackle the same things.
Okay, thank you. So that was a really useful insight into the extent of intergovernmental kind of collaboration in this space to date. We've got a decent chunk of time now for questions from the floor, and I include our folks watching online as the floor. So colleagues are going to be keeping an eye on the questions coming in virtually. But I'm going to start by looking in the room. Gentleman here.
Thank you, Jenna. Those of us who heard Tony Juniper speak on Wednesday evening will have heard him talk about the importance of conserving livestock and crop genetic diversity. I'd be interested to know what each of your governments proposes to do on that. In saying that, I'm conscious, firstly, that in Wales you have particularly worked up policies for that in your options. I'm also conscious that when I raised this point with Minister Poots in Northern Ireland a couple of years ago, he called me an idiot. So I'm sensing it's not so much of a priority there, but I'd be interested to go and hear what each of your governments thinks about it. Thank you.
And because we're limited for time, if you can keep to like 30 seconds each. And you have got another mic.
Okay, maintaining that diversity, both in animals and crops, is important. I mean, those at the other conference yesterday would have seen some of the approaches to tackling some of the plant diseases involves looking back to varieties that are not currently in use commercially, but actually it's the genetics in others that are important. We're having to look at it very closely in Scotland. We're introducing, as part of our suckler beef calf scheme, a calving interval limitation to try and reduce wasted emissions. There are some concerns that might disadvantage native breeds. So, we have to be careful that we don't, through policies being designed to tackle important issues like climate change, inadvertently have an impact on genetic diversity.
Thank you. I think you might have been in my dining room last night having dinner, so I overheard some of your conversation, sorry. Anyway, thanks for that question. We have recently had a farm support and development programme launched by DERA, our Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. And if we are committed to a key word being resilience, then yes, we need to be clear that we are advocating for diversity and native breeds and looking at maintaining that diversity in crops as well. I mean, there's a very, very risky strategy. We're talking about food security. I mean, we're reliant on 3 or 4 countries for so much of our fresh goods. It's really important subject to talk about. In terms of livestock, the balance needs to be right. It's a very delicate subject in parts of Northern Ireland because we have such livestock production. But I would urge the media to be very careful about how they select certain narratives to focus on that are volatile, like culling. The strategy is part of a wider farm support and development programme that looks at biodiversity, climate, emissions, and it's not helpful when the media pull out misinformation out of context. In Northern Ireland, there's definitely an encouragement around reducing dependency on soya and growing own proteins, also good for multi-species swards and things like that to increase diversity and resilience. And we also have a number of experiments going on and a living lab for trialling new things and novel crops as well.
Yeah, I mean, I other than agreeing that genetic resilience is absolutely critical in underpinning our food and farming systems, I can't comment really on where the Labour government are at. I know George Eustice was a passionate defender of this, actually, and it is critically important. He used to talk about the sort of genetic diversity as the Noah's Ark of agriculture. So really important, and I think that needs to be part of the resilience conversation, but I can't comment on the specifics of the government.
I mean, only very briefly, absolutely, I think native breeds incredibly important to Wales. The 2 things I was just going to pick up very quickly are some of the habitat measures we're proposing on the Sustainable Farming Scheme are very much designed to support that diversity, so things like multi-species swards, etc. And the other thing that we are very conscious of is that we have a relatively low horticulture or very small horticulture sector in Wales, and that is something that we are very keen to grow. So we've got a couple of schemes at the moment that have been running for a few years to try and support that. We've also just very recently, the Deputy First Minister did a written statement in the Senedd talking about looking at sort of planning policy to try and support horticulture, all part of that sort of broader resilience piece.
Great, we'll take another one from in the room before we go to the screen. I'm going to go to the chap at the front who's wearing my fleece.
Thank you. A question for John Marco. I'm a Welsh farmer. You claim the direct payments as almost as a success, keeping them going for farmers, but it's at the expense, what I can see, of the environmental payments. So you've cut the ag environmental payments by almost 50%. I think we're probably below 10% now. We're racing to the bottom. We'll be with you if it carries on, from above 20%. What this means on the ground is I've got some awesome hay meadows on my farm. For almost 20 years, we've been having over £200 a hectare to manage these. Last year and this year, I'm getting £6.95 a hectare. Now, how does this all comply with this legal framework you talk about, which you signed in August 23?
So ministers in Wales took the decision last year and for 2025 to protect the basic payment scheme, to provide that certainty for farmers, because we recognised that an awful lot of other things were changing, and we recognised there were an awful lot of other pressures. It doesn't mean we haven't invested in what we're calling at the moment the rural investment schemes that are part of the preparatory phase. We've got, for the draft budget for 25-26, we've got over £100 million set aside for things like Habitat Wales, for the horticulture schemes, for small-scale environment schemes. So we're trying to do both, but there is no doubt that if you look at the 24-25 budget in Wales, not dissimilar to George in Scotland, because of wider pressures on the Welsh Government budget, we had to surrender about £50 million from the rural affairs budget, because the Welsh Government was facing a £1 billion hole. So, there is no doubt that there is a monetary, or there is a financial pressure. We're trying to do both. We're trying to both provide an element of stability to farmers ahead of the SFS coming in, but also put as much money as possible as we can into the successor of the RDP agri-environment schemes. That has meant that we've had to cut some payment rates for instance, for Habitat Wales compared to Glassdeer. But the thing I always say is you can't compare the two. They're not like for like schemes. The requirements for Habitat Wales are far fewer. We've streamlined them compared to Glassdeer. So the payment rate, we did do an independent analysis of the payment rates to try and bring them up to date. So it wasn't just a budgetary decision that reduced those. It was also a recognition that the requirements for Habitat Wales were different to our RDP requirements. But in the end, going forward, and the Deputy First Minister has been very clear, we need to have a commensurate budget to be able to deliver everything we're trying to do under SFS. And that is something that is common across the four nations. We know, that the current settlement is not going to be sufficient in that sense. And we do need to look at multi-annual budgets. We need to look at providing more certainty. But that is one of this isn't a political point, I'm a civil servant, but this is one of the realities of being outside the European Union. We've moved from a 7-year budget cycle to what has been very recently, at best, a 3-year comprehensive spending review, but still on an annual basis. So,
great, thank you. We're going to go and take one from online. Is it David?
Yeah, there's a few questions come through online. One directed at you, Gianmarco, but I think it has relevance for the other panellists as well, and concerns about plans for solar farms on Anglesey and the potential impact on land being available for arable production. Now, I wonder, the other panellists might have some thoughts on how the different administrations are managing those competing demands on land use for food production, renewable energy, nature restoration, forestry, etc.
I think the question hits at a fundamental point, that we have a finite amount of land, and we're trying to do an awful lot of things with it. We're trying to produce sufficient food in a sustainable way. Realistically, we need to plant some of that land with trees if we're going to sequester sufficient carbon. We're looking at other ways of mitigating climate change, things like solar farms, etc. So it is, land use and land use planning, and how you balance those competing priorities is difficult. It struck me yesterday listening to Steve Reed. He talked about diversification. He talked about having a planning system that enables things like, bigger chicken sheds. But, again, you look at that, and there are consequences of that. So it is, deciding what to do with the finite amount of land that you have in a way that takes into account the communities that live there. And that is one of the big things in Wales. We've had an awful lot of angst and concern about investment coming in from outside Wales, perhaps buying up land for carbon sequestration projects without the engagement of the communities. And what's really important, I think, in all of this in the end, is that engagement with the communities. Because there are people who live there, there are people who send their children to school there, there are people who work there. And I think, however we try and square this increasingly difficult circle, we've got to have that engagement with communities, I think.
we see very, very similar issues in Scotland, including in relation to solar farms, because the parts of Scotland that are suitable for that are also the parts that are suitable for horticulture in particular. So very similar challenges. I think there's maybe a bit of a parallel with trees and agriculture, that sometimes those are seen as opposites and they can't mix, and actually we see that there are opportunities to mix trees and agriculture. Similarly on solar energy, you can do that in a way that doesn't sterilize the ground and prevent other uses, but actually you can combine the solar energy with other uses. So I think encouragement on that. But we've also seen it again on the east coast of Scotland. Yep, offshore wind, great, fantastic, making a big difference to what the country's doing on climate change. But you need cables, you need the power to get from offshore to the places where it's going to be used. And that has been a big issue in some of the communities down the east coast of Scotland, who are the ones being affected by the power lines. And similar to Gian Marco's point, it's sometimes it's the quality of the community engagement that is critical there.
Have you?
Yeah, I can talk to that. So, the Labour government, the UK Labour government has committed to planning reform. It has committed to some really ambitious missions on renewable energy and on housing too. There will be huge pressure on UK but English land use in the next few years ahead of 2030, whilst those missions are driven towards. And so there are risks, huge risks with that. I think the land use framework will be really important within this, working back from what is the best place to put certain things on our land. But the community engagement point is absolutely pivotal to all of that, because without that you cannot legitimise the stuff that you're doing. And I don't think that the government will get to where they want without that engagement. They are being very bold, and Miliband is quite boldly talking about renewable energy rollout. But that has to be grounded in that community engagement and buy-in, and the land use framework will be a part of that. It won't contribute to all of it. On solar specifically, I'm going to stick my neck out on the line a bit here and just say, look, we should be building obviously on rooftops and warehouses where we can, of course. We should also be prioritising areas of land that are not high-grade agricultural land, but we do have space to put solar on our land, and the analysis of how much we will need shows that it is a tiny fraction of total land take. And if it means getting us closer to our net zero targets, I think that's a good thing, but we have to be strategic about it. The strategic nature of all of this is how we will get to where we need to, and also ensuring that we're using land for different things at the same time. Multifunctionality is the other phrase that gets bandied about too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can graze under solar panels. It's possible. Lady over here.
Hi, we know how important it is for us to meet our net zero targets, and we know we have this vision of being a global leader in sustainable farming. And I know it's just been covered about Steve Reed, but how do you feel about him allowing more intensive chicken houses to be built, on land that could be used for better farming initiatives, for the just transition? I'm interested, from the different nations, how you feel about that.
I mean, look, intensive poultry is I guess it's not necessarily so much the land use issue, it's the intensiveness of the production. I think I think there are some real serious challenges that come with allowing that sort of production to be amplified, particularly in catchments where it can cause real damage. I think it kind of links to a wider question that's going to become more and more pertinent in the next few years as the Climate Change Committee guidance comes through that basically says if we don't shift diets away from not just red meat but from all forms of meat, not entirely, there is a role for livestock in our agriculture systems that is absolutely fundamental, but we do need to reduce consumption and probably production. So those intensive forms of poultry production may not be conducive to that. And I think there are real risks there, and there's a lot of stuff that I know Sustain are doing on planning at the moment. I'm not an expert in it, but I think it's a real challenge, yeah.
Just linking back to our multifunctional land use framework again, I mean, if we are looking holistically at food security and production in sustainable ways, there will invariably be some intensification, but that shouldn't be the goal. We should be valuing small farmers and what they can bring to habitats. So I think I would like to have more detail on what the plans were. The interest in chicken meat has obviously arisen out of the objection to red meat. So I think we should expect that there is some interest in chicken meat, but we need to be really careful about how we manage that.
I could dodge this question by saying any changes to the planning system in England don't automatically read across to Scotland or Wales, but there are issues in Scotland. We're having to, we're looking at the state of our poultry sector, where at the moment we are dependent essentially on one large processor and their supply chain. There may be advantages in some level of intensification. You're replacing older chicken sheds with more modern facilities that will allow better emission control. But I don't think that we think the answer is intensification everywhere.
The only thing to add, I mean, our ministers are very seized by water quality issues in Wales. So I think we're looking across the piece. I mean, you'll know we've got agricultural pollution regulations in force in Wales, which again have caused a lot of debate. But we are very much looking in all of our policies relating to agriculture at that element as well. So what is the impact on water quality of our rivers and our seas? So that's got to be part of the conversation in all of this, I think.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for probably one more, and I'm going to go to those watching at home, or rather David is.
Thank you. Yeah, this question actually goes back to a point that Alex referenced in regard to Steve Reed's speech yesterday about the Precision Breeding Act. If England goes ahead with this, as seems to be the case, how do the devolved administrations protect themselves or citizens from products crossing the border, for example, genetically engineered seeds or plants or other foodstuffs?
I feel like I've been left with the microphone. So I think this is a really interesting case study in a way of how devolution works at the moment, particularly in a post-Brexit world. We know that the Act only applies to England, but deregulation of gene-edited materials in England has an impact on the devolved because of things like the UK Internal Market Act. So it is something we're following very very closely. You know, ministers in Wales traditionally have had a particular view regarding you know, genetic modification. So there are things around labelling, for instance, that are going to be, you know, potentially really important. But yeah, at the moment, it's very much a sort of trying to better understand exactly what it will mean in England and what the impacts might be on Wales. But yeah, there's a bit of watch this space, I think, about it. But it is an interesting test, I think, of how devolution works in a post-Brexit world.
Yeah, very similar position in Scotland. I mean, the Scottish Government, you know, strong opposition to genetic modification, more nuanced position on gene editing. Actually, a lot of the science on that has actually been done in Scotland. Our position is we've been wanting to watch developments in Europe, and you'll know that the European Commission was getting quite close to legislating on this before the European elections and the new Commission coming into place. In particular, because we didn't want you know, what we saw as the initiative of the previous UK government, which was a rather gung-ho you know, approach to allowing precision breeding both for plants and animals, creating yet another set of trade barriers between us and our largest export market. So our position is probably to align more with the European system. We've yet to see how quickly Europe moves on this. But as Gianmarco says, within the UK, if England does move on this, the effect of the Internal Market Act is such that there is absolutely nothing we can do to stop those products coming across the border and being used in Scotland with no labelling, no other indication. So we are, you know, we're well and truly stuffed, you might say. And now we hope for dialogue with the UK government, and said earlier that's a much more promising situation now. But you know, we may be in a position where gene-edited products will be on the shelves in Scotland without anything that we can do about it. So we'll watch the space.
Thank you. We are virtually out of time, so I'm going to wrap us up. Just wanted to, I suppose, say, this session really, I suppose, it's kind of scratched the surface of the complexities facing the food and farming system that we occupy, both as UK nations, within the UK as a whole, and obviously part of a global system. I think what has become very, very clear, if it wasn't clear to us all already, is in no part of the UK have we got all of those kind of constituent ingredients in place, whether it's, and certainly resources. We can all agree that we haven't got the right amount of money anywhere. And we will only get positive change if all those things are in place and they are all talking to each other, as in within the UK and beyond UK borders. So if nothing else, I think this has been a real kind of reminder of just how urgent the challenges are and how urgent the kind of pace of change needs to be. And we are all part of that movement. And to end on a kind of positive, which there's been lots of references to, yes, we are swimming in challenges, but we are also swimming in opportunities and positives and positive opportunities for change. Thank you, and thank you to the panel.